Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Natapada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payurasho Murakedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupo Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surito Pangor Mama Mandamate Guti Matsarvas Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Iha Viharati Radha Krishna Kunjarikari Tarubhaya Rasarite Shuddha Siddhanta Dhari Sakala Sujana Geya Krishna Dasa Videya Param Akila Gunanam Kaviraja Kavinam Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Gadai Shila Tahate na hoilo morachita Jeba nahi bujikeva shunite shunite seha Kiad bhuta chaitanya charit Krishna upajive priti janivera serariti Shunile borohohit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Gyatam Gyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhakta Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnav acaryas, Sri Rupa Gosvami, his revered companion Sanatana Gosvami, his dear additional companion Raghunath Das Goswami. Nourished by them all, we have Sri Krishna Das Kaviraja Goswami, a graceful swan in this inexhaustible reservoir of Gaura Lila, wherefrom the very essence of the Krishna Lila streams in the 10 directions. By his grace, today we continue discussion of Caitanya-caritamrta. And in particular, we're here in the Madhya Lila, Sanatan Shiksha, chapter 22, about the Abhideya Tattva. And today we begin a new prakaran, the section on Vaidhi-bhakti. So over the recent classes, we discussed the definition of Sadhana-bhakti from the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, as well as the 2 payars here in the Caritamrita, where the meaning of that definition is explained. So we went into some details about what the purpose of the definition was, what were the concerns regarding it and its manner of composition that Rupa Gosvami had, which he applied in the course of composing it, and how Jiva Gosvami and Visvanatha Cakravarti elucidated that. And we also touched briefly on some of the discourse centuries later that has cropped up regarding these verses due to this postulation of the idea of the inherency of bhakti. So we've demonstrated that there's no such implication in this definition of sadhana-bhakti or the payars that describe it. So today we'll come now to the discussion of Vaidhi-bhakti. So for the rest of this chapter, Vaidhi-bhakti and its limbs, and then Raganuga-bhakti are described. So now we're going, you could say, into a subset of Sadhana-bhakti. So today, we probably won't get through it all today, but we'll start our analysis of Vaidhi-bhakti. And for those who might think, oh, I want to be a Raganuga Bhakta, well, it's very important to understand what Vaidhi-bhakti is in order to be a Raganuga Bhakta. This will help everyone. So I start from the top of a fresh file. This is starting from Payar 108. So, now that Sadhana-bhakti has been defined in general in the last 3 verses, 2 fundamental types of Sadhana-bhakti are introduced in the following Payar. Eto Sadhana-bhakti duito prakar, ek Vaidhi-bhakti Raganuga-bhakti ar. The aforesaid Sadhana-bhakti is of 2 types. One is Vaidhi-bhakti and the other is Raganuga-bhakti. Sri Rupa similarly states in his introduction to this subject matter in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, Vaidhi-raganuga chaitisa dvivida sadhana-bhida. That type of Uttama Bhakti known as sadhana is of 2 types, Vaidhi and Raganuga. In the following Payar, Vaidhi-bhakti is defined, and in the ensuing verses up to verse 148 in this chapter, Vaidhi-bhakti is discussed in detail. Then, for the remainder of the chapter, Raganuga-bhakti is discussed, and in the commentary on one of the verses that comes later, I haven't decided where to put it, a comparative analysis of Vaidhi and Raganuga, the Vaidhi and Raganuga paths is offered. So, we'll get to some comparative analysis after we've explained and discussed what's on the table. So, Ragahina jan bhaje shastrera agyaya, Vaidhi-bhakti bolitare sarva shastra gaya. A person devoid of raga worships Bhagavan on the order of the Shastra. All the Shastras praise this as Vaidhi-bhakti. So, here, Vaidhi-bhakti is being defined obviously not based on, or rather, it's being defined partially based on its etymological basis, and secondly on the basis of an absence. So, by saying, Bhaje Shastrera Agyaya, that one worships on the order of the Shastra. So, Shastra comes from Shasdatu, which means to control or to direct. And the word Vaidhi is derived from the word Vidhi. So Vaidhi means essentially Vidhi-based, or based on Vidhi. So Vidhi means an injunction or a direction. So essentially, to describe something as Vaidhi-bhakti means it's bhakti based on injunction, or motivated by injunction. So Bhaje Shastrera Agyaya conveys that it is bhajan that is performed on the order of the Shastra, or on the injunction of the Shastra. But because it's necessary to define Vaidhi-bhakti also in comparison to Raganuga-bhakti, or to explain the distinction between the two, he says raga-hina, that it's done by a person who doesn't have raga. So a person without raga, who does bhajan based on the injunctions in the Shastra, the bhakti performed by that person is called Vaidhi-bhakti. So this much we can derive from the Payar, and if we look in the commentaries on the Sindhu, we can get a bit more subtle understanding. So, the import of this Payar and the usage of the term raga within it can be gleaned from Sri Rupa Pad's definition of Vaidhi-bhakti in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu and the commentaries thereupon. So, this Payar, as we'll see, is closely derived from the definition of Vaidhi-bhakti in the Sindhu, which is as follows: Yatra rag anavapta tattvat prabrittir upajayate shashane naiva shastrasya savaidhi bhaktir uchyate. That bhakti, in regard to which the inclination to enact it arises only from the Shastra's ruling, because of that inclination's not being acquired from raga, is called Vaidhi. So, even in the way Rupa Gosvami defines Vaidhi-bhakti, he's in one sense building in an inferiority to Raganuga bhakti. Or, to say, this is what people do when they lack X. The implication is that having X would have been good, or would have been desirable. It conveys an undertone of being like, a secondary option. But not that we say that in any way to demean those who follow the path of Vaidhi-bhakti or those who cherish the path of bhakti, not at all. But nevertheless, to be, so to speak, true to the spirit of Rupa Goswami, he carries obviously a preference, and he seeks to exalt the path of Raganuga as he's designed it here in this text. So we can appreciate both the subtle ways that he privileges the thing that he personally practices or what he considers great, but at the same time it's also very much integral to the view of Rupa Goswami and the community, or the corporate group, as some scholars have called them, of the Goswamis, that there is unwavering and profound respect for bhaktas of any type. That this isn't meant to be some sort of lead to an egotistic sense of superiority to others or anything like that. So we want to capture both of those sides of this discussion. We want to inculcate great respect for all bhaktas of all types, but at the same time see that Rupa Goswami has an underlying preference and seeks to convey the beauty of Raganuga bhakti in particular. Anyway, that will hopefully unfold naturally in the course of the discussion. So, that bhakti in regard to which the inclination arises only from the Shastra's ruling because of not being acquired from raga is called Vaidhi. So what we can grasp here and what will come out in the discussion is that what distinguishes Raganuga bhakti from Vaidhi-bhakti is not so much the activities, but the inclination for which the bhakti is performed. So when the inclination comes not from raga, but only because of the rule of Shastra, then you have Vaidhi-bhakti. So he's not saying Vaidhi-bhakti is activity A or activity B, that Vaidhi-bhaktas do practice 1 and Raganuga bhaktas do practice B. He's not making any distinction like that here. He's just saying that when the motivation is not raga and only injunction, then you call that Vaidhi-bhakti. So, another critical point here is when he's speaking about the absence of the inclination or the pravritti being acquired or being motivated or inspired by raga, what does this word raga mean? Let's bear in mind that at this point in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, the word raga has not been defined. So this is a completely new term that's entering the flow of discourse at this moment in the text. So therefore, we'll see now that Jiva Gosvami immediately comes in there as a commentator and helps the reader understand that, or flags, so to speak, that this is a highly significant technical term, or in other words, a term that has a very precise definition that comes later in the text. So, Sri Jivapad comments as follows. Bhakti, in regard to which a person's inclination to enact it arises only from the Shastra's ruling. Because of that inclination's not being acquired from raga, that type of bhakti is called Vaidhi, literally, quote, injunction-based. So here, the word raga refers to deep attachment, or anuraga. So we know that later in the Ujjal Nilamani, Rupa Goswami does make a distinction in the higher exalted states of prema between raga and anuraga. So you might say, why is Jiva Gosvami here defining raga as anuraga? Well, this is more because at this stage, none of those terms have been defined yet, and so he's bringing out a word which is more readily intuitable to readers who aren't acquainted yet with this systematic set of definitions. And the word raga in broader Sanskrit literature doesn't always or exclusively evoke a sense of loving attachment. It can also refer to passion, it can also refer to passion going towards lust, it can also refer to passion going towards anger. Even in modern day Bengali, rag means anger in a very colloquial way. So, I remember even one case of a couple of Bangladeshi Vaishnavas who were living in Europe and accepted, diksha from a foreign guru, and the lady was given the name Raga Mai, and she was very uncomfortable with it because in common, Bengali speak, rag means anger. Raga Mai, like, what are you calling me? Like, angry lady? So, and then I had to kind of explain this to the non-Bengali speaking guru who was giving this name to the Bengali lady, that she's not comfortable with this name because you're thinking raga like the raga of ragatmika, but she's thinking raga like the anger of, family life, So this is not going to quite work here. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to go on a tangent. I'm just reminded of that. So the reason I just tell that little anecdote is just that the word raga has a broad scope of meaning. So Jiva Gosvami is immediately offering the word anuraga, which the more collective and broader connotation in Sanskrit literature, that term is more widely used to refer specifically to an idea of loving attachment or deep attachment. So he's saying here, rag means anurag. Even though later there's going to be a more technical usage to those two terms, this isn't a fault, this is just an attempt to reach the reader using non-technical language at this stage in the text. But by speaking of that raga as anuraga, what we'll find out later in the text this refers to is the deep attachment or anurag that impels ragatmika bhaktas in their acts of bhakti. Now here is the second point that is very significant in this explanation. And, so the word raga means anurag, in other words, it means the rag of the ragatmika bhaktas, and taste or ruchi for that. That is, taste for the raga of ragatmika bhaktas, which impels the actions of raganuga bhakti. On account of the distinction between ragatmika bhakti and raganuga bhakti being to be stated ahead in verses 270 to 72. That is, the meaning of the term raga here is used here in this verse 6 of the second chapter, and in the payar we're talking about here in the Caitanya-caritamrta. The usage is derived from how the term raga will be defined later in 1-270 to 72, and these verses will be discussed later in verses 150 to 156 here in Caitanya-caritamrta. So what he's dealing with here, or you might say, okay, raga means raga. Rupa Gosvami is saying, okay, bhakti not motivated by raga is called Vaidhi, and later he defines raga as part of ragatmika. So why is Jiva Gosvami bringing this word ruchi here? So the reason he's bringing ruchi here is because if you defined here raga as only raga alone and not ruchi for raga, right, where he says taste for, quote, that, tad ruchi. So the word tad there means raga. So he's saying the word raga means raga and ruchi for raga. So why does it need to mean ruchi for raga in addition to just raga? Because if you defined bhakti as being not the inclination for which is not coming from raga, then, as we'll see later, raganuga bhakti would also fit that definition, because raganuga bhakti is also not the inclination to perform Raganuga Bhakti is also not raga, because Raganuga Bhakti is bhakti that's trying to attain that raga. So the motivation for Raganuga Bhakti, as we'll see, is the ruchi or the lobha for that raga. But if you defined Vaidhi-bhakti as only bhakti not motivated by raga, then your definition of Vaidhi-bhakti would still cover the scope of what later gets defined as Raganuga Bhakti. So to ensure that the definition of Raganuga Bhakti is distinct from the definition of Vaidhi-bhakti, Jiva Gosvami adds tadruchi here, tadruchischa. So one little phrase, but very important. So in other words, when the inclination to perform the bhakti is not motivated by raga, in other words, when it's not ragatmika bhakti, and the inclination is not arising from ruchi for raga, or desire, taste, longing for a raga, as in the case of Raganuga Bhakti, then you have what is called Vaidhi-bhakti. Okay, so now he comes, in the second half of the line, there was this phrase, shastrena eva, shastrenaiva, it's put into sandhi. So why is that little eva stuck in the word there? Stuck in the compound or part of the verse. So on account of the usage of the word only, eva, in the phrase, in the verse, only from the ruling of Shastra, shasanena eva, when one's inclinations having been attained from raga to occurs, then Vaidiness is to be understood only in part. That is, one's sadhana-bhakti should be considered to be Vaidhi-bhakti only partially, meaning then one's sadhana-bhakti is partially Vaidhi-bhakti and partially Raganuga Bhakti. So the definition then is that when the inclination comes only from the shasan, only from the rule, then you have Vaidhi-bhakti. So what if the motivation comes from the rule, but not only from the rule? Then it would be, an inclination that's both from the rule and from something else. And as we'll see, there's only two categories that Rupa Gosvami gives. So that would imply that the second category, the Raganuga category, where there's taste or there's desire for raga, that also is part of the cause of the inclination. So he's creating the idea that Vaidhi-bhakti refers to the situation where one's motivation or one's inclination is only based on the rule. But when you have an instance where someone's motivation is based on both, then that is not under the category of Vaidhi-bhakti. So that's the significance of the eva in this verse. And what the comment, quote, that Vaidhitva, or this Vaidiness, I'm sorry for the neologism here, but I felt like it ultimately made it more clear than to put it into a phrase. Angshene naiva Vaidhitva, that the Vaidiness, or the sadhana one's doing, that it's, quote unquote, has the state of being Vaidhi-bhakti, is Angshena eva. It's only Angshena, it's only with a part. In other words, there's another part that's not Vaidhi, that other part has become Raganuga because the inclination, which is characteristic of Raganuga, is also there. So this also shows that the two are not antagonistic. In other words, it's not that following Vaidhi-bhakti is going to necessarily take you away from being a Raganuga sadhaka, but rather that the two can, and in fact do, intertwine or, work together very well in the vast majority of cases of sadhakas who do follow the system of sadhana taught by the Goswamis based on a clear education in what that process is, and who aren't already born with a high level of chitta shuddhi and a deep samskar for bhakti such that their attainment happens very rapidly. Then the reality of the situation is that it will be in this intertwined or this combined state in all likelihood. And that's something that we'll get to later in the course of this discussion. Jiva Gosvami elaborates further on the blending of the two, but it'll get confusing if we start talking about the blending until we've defined the two and there's a clear understanding of what the two elements are, once it's clear the difference between them, then we can start talking about how they can become interwoven. Okay, so now let's look at Chakravarti Pad's comments. He says, now, here, in regard to inclination in general towards sadhana-bhakti, and so forth, that is, and Bhava-bhakti and Prema-bhakti, there is sometimes causativeness of intense desire, lobha, and sometimes of the ruling of Shastra. That is, intense desire, which Sri Jiva Pad referred to as taste, ruchi, in the aforecited commentary, is the cause of some person's inclination towards sadhana-bhakti and so forth, and the ruling of Shastra is the cause of some person's inclination towards sadhana-bhakti. And one other point, this, quote, ruchi that's being spoken of here is not exclusively synonymous with the ruchi that Rupa Gosvami speaks about later in chapter 4 of the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu in these stages of anartha nivritti, nishta, ruchi, asakti, bhava, prema. That categorical type of ruchi is not directly equivalent to the ruchi that's being talked about now. And that's something that we'll also clarify later on. But just in case that's popping up in anyone's mind, just for clarity, I'm making that point. So Chakravarti Pad is giving context. In other words, because at this stage in the text, this whole Raganuga process hasn't been defined yet, and now you're getting this thing that when the motivation is not this thing that we haven't defined, then he's giving the reader some point of reference for what's being said at this stage and saying that the motivation or the inclination to do bhakti is of two types. It can be lobh or it can be the rule of Shastra. So in this regard, furthermore, that bhakti in regard to which there is no causativeness of intense desire, lobha, and rather only causativeness of the Shastra's ruling, is called Vaidhi-bhakti. Thus, the author says yatra, that is, he writes this verse. In this case, the term raga refers to intense desire, lobha, for performing worship that has arisen from sight of a beautiful deity or from hearing of the various leelas of Bhagavan Sri Krishna in the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. So, Chakravarti Pad here is referring to raga and saying raga just only means lobh. In other words, he's not even bothering to say that it refers to the raga of ragatmika bhakti, which would be the more literal meaning. Raga, etymologically, obviously, is the raga of ragatmika. But because this whole section is about sadhana, and anyone who's actually a ragatmika bhakta wouldn't be reading this book in the first place, they're already, absorbed in Bhagavan's lila, then, practically speaking, he's really getting to the point and saying, here, raga means actually what Jiva Gosvami called ruchi for the raga, and Rupa Gosvami himself uses the word lobha to speak about that later in the text. So he's just coming straight to the point and saying here, when the bhakti is motivated not by the rule of Shastra and not by lobha, not by what motivates raganuga, then it's Vaidhi-bhakti. So this is, you could say, more blunt, and it might seem less literal, but when you've read the text as a whole, you can see he's just coming straight to the exact practical meaning of what's being said. So his comment is also very nice. And then he gives an explanation of where does that lobha come from. So that's something that is further discussed later on and is oftentimes a topic that devotees ask about. So this little precursor comment, so to speak, of Chakravarti Pad is also nice in this regard. So in other words, where do you get a desire? He's saying, from a sight or a sound. In other words, you can't desire something that you have no awareness of. You can only desire something that somehow you know about or somehow you have some samskar for. So, in the past, before modern technology like phones and the internet were invented, no one desired them because they had no concept. No one said, I want this brand of this device or whatever, because there were no such brands, there were no such devices. But once someone acquires awareness of some particular thing that has great utility or beauty or attractiveness, then they can feel the desire for it. So he's saying, where does the desire come from? It comes from the sight of a deity or hearing of a lila. In other words, it comes from perception of some type of something that has desirability, something that's beautiful, something that evokes desire. And this is a point that he elaborates on in the Vaidhi-marga, which we'll get to later on, but because it's a very central point, we can add just a little bit here, where he simply says, Shrute drishte apaniya loba, ati lobaniya vastuni, that where does loba come from? It comes from hearing and seeing very desirable things. It's that simple. And this is something that relates to practical life. As we'll see, when Jiva Gosvami starts to explain what is raga, he explains it based on sense experience. And he says that the attraction that objects of the senses, that someone with senses feels for particular sense objects, that's raga. He just, speaks very plainly in that respect in the Bhakti-sandarbha, which we'll discuss later on. So Cakravarti-pad, applying that line of thought, is simply saying that when you hear about something that's highly attractive, you'll start to desire it. In other words, desire is something that unfolds naturally based on exposure. It's not something you have to create, so to speak, but it's something that will just naturally ensue from acquiring certain samskaras. So to have darshan of Krishna in the form of a beautiful deity, or you could add to that beautiful art or other visual representation of Krishna, and to hear about his lila, in other words, to hear about the expression of his form, his qualities, etc., then those things elicit, or those things evoke, what he calls here loba. So, who will lack loba? Those who have no such sight, and those who have no such hearing. Or in other words, those who haven't had the privilege of hearing and seeing such things, they won't desire them, because they have no samskar. So, that's something we'll discuss later, but that's in gist what he's bringing out here. So that bhakti, the inclination for which arises only from the Shastra's ruling, because of that is the aforementioned ragas, meaning lobhas, not being acquired, that is, because of its being independent of such raga, that is not impelled by it, it is called Vaidhi. So when someone's inclination is based on the injunctions that they've heard, such as in this chapter earlier on in verses, I think it was 27 and 28, we heard this point made in the 11th canto that the 4 varnas, the 4 ashramas, they all manifest from the body of the Purush, and the Supreme Purush is like the original source, like the original father of all living beings. So it's incumbent upon everyone to worship him. And if you don't, you enter into a degraded position. You undergo negative consequences for neglecting to worship Bhagavan. And this is a verse that will come a little bit later in this same section, where the Shastra says it's incumbent upon every entity to do worship, and if you don't, it will be to your detriment. So, if persons are exposed to discourse like that, then they might say, well, then I better do some worship. I better show gratitude and respect to this original source, this original basis of all of existence. So if the motivation is based like that, if the motivation is based on an injunction which says you ought to do this, then the inclination that one has to do bhakti is injunction based, therefore it's called Vaidhi. So those verses that I just referred to are quoted a little further ahead in the text again, so more on that later. To clarify that the essential distinction between Vaidhi-bhakti and Raganuga bhakti lies in the nature of the inclination, or prabritti, that motivates one to enact these forms of bhakti. Sri Cakravarti-pad contrasts these two forms of bhakti specifically on that very basis early on in his Vaidhi-marga. So this point of Cakravarti-pad is very insightful, And it's an addition to anything that you'll find in the commentaries directly on the Sindhu. In other words, in the Durgama Sangamani and the Bhakti-sar Pradarshani, these points are implied, but this couple of little verses that Chakravarti Pad writes in this slightly more elaborate text on the topic, the Ragvartma Chandrika, really encapsulates the subject. So this is a very nice point to grasp this subject matter. So he writes a couple of verses as follows. Vaidhi-bhaktir bhavet shastram bhakto chet syat pravartakam raganuga syat chet bhakto loba eva pravartakaha bhakto pravrittiyatra syat tat chikirsha sunishchaya shastrat lobhat tachikirshu syatam tat adhikarino. Vaidhi-bhakti shall be when the motivator for bhakti shall be Shastra, that is, the injunctions of the Shastra. Raganuga bhakti shall be when the motivator for bhakti shall be intense desire, lobha specifically. So what's the distinction? It's the motivator for the performance. So this pravartaka is the word he's using, and he's using synonymous with the word that was here in the Sindhu commentaries, the pravritti. So now, this is the layer of further subtlety that he adds here. In the Sindhu commentaries, you say, the pravritti is like this for one, the pravritti is like that for the other. So pravritti, an inclination. But what is actually an inclination? So he, in a sense, gives like a definition of the definition, or he defines a term inside the definition. So this is another layer of precision. So he says, in this regard, an inclination, or pravritti towards bhakti, which may be either of the two aforementioned types, shall be understood as a firmly resolved desire to enact that, namely bhakti. So this little phrase, tat chikirsha sunishchaya. So chikirsha is what you call a I can never pronounce this word, a desiderative grammatical form in Sanskrit, which is something that we don't have in English, where the state of being desirous of something is just referred to with a single word. So not that you're doing it, but that you have a desire to do such a thing. They have a way of speaking of that of deriving a word deriving from the word for a particular activity, a word for having a desire to perform that activity. So that's what they call the I can never say this word, desiderative. Anyway. So what he's saying is tat chikirsha, to have the desire to do it. And that desire is sunishchoy. It's of firm conviction or of firm resolve. So for all of us who aspire to follow this path, what will be the thing that propels us on the path? What is like the force that causes we have like locomotion engines, trains are run on steam engines or coal engines or whatever. Like what is the force that propels the person on the path? That's what's being spoken of here as the pravritti. So if we want to go far, then we'll do well if we have a strong, cause of locomotion, so to speak. So he's saying that cause of motion, so to speak, has two aspects. It has a desire aspect, and it also has what he calls nishchoy, which you could say is an intellectual aspect or a conceptual aspect, that there's an understanding, there's a resolution and a conviction about the value of doing the activity or of the value of attaining the object of the activity, and there's a desire for that. So in many cases, the two are intertwined. In other words, we might have a desire for something, but then when we realize that object of desire is not actually that valuable, then the desire wanes. But if we feel an inclination to something, and beyond that, when we understand that attaining that is extremely beneficial or extremely meaningful or extremely valuable, then that can fortify or make the desire even more robust. So all of this study, all of this analysis, all of these texts, all of this poetry, all of these natakas, all of these leelas, all of these things, in one sense, the fundamental psychological function that they have, this whole process of study and contemplation, can be to solidify the pravriti, or to give rise to the nishchoy, give rise to the conviction, and fortify the desire to perform, or the wish to act. So whether one studies Shastra and acquires conviction and desire based on the injunctions of Shastra, or whether one hears, sees art or hears lila or these other sides that enkindle the desire for what we'll ultimately see as the bhava, various ragatmika parikaras, then all such cultivation, study, hearing, chanting, repetition, contemplation, remembrance, all of this is nourishing the samskaras, which the effect of which is the fortification of this chakirsha, this desire to act, and this sunishchoy, this firm resolve. So, without any further elaboration, therefore, the difference between Vaidhi-bhakti and Raganuga-bhakti is the character of the pravriti. A pravriti is a desire to act that's coupled with or based on a firm resolve to perform such action. So lastly, he says, those possessed of desire to enact that, namely bhakti, because of Shastra, that is the injunctions of Shastra, or because of intense desire, shall be the two bearers of eligibility for that is for bhakti, meaning for Vaidhi-bhakti and Raganuga-bhakti, respectively. So this constitutes the adhikar, or the eligibility, the extent of one's ability to, or fitness to engage in this is informed by that intensity of that desire, or the intensity of that commitment to action based on the injunction of the Shastra. So anyway, I think that's probably clear. In summary, the term raga in the payar under discussion. So now if we go all the way back, in the Caritamrta, what did we get? We heard that a person devoid of raga worships on the order of the Shastra. So what does then this person devoid of raga, who does that referring to? Based on all this analysis of these commentators, we can understand that the term raga in the payar under discussion refers to the raga of Sri Bhagavan's Ragatmika Bhaktas, and to what Sri Rupa Pad calls the intense desire, and Sri Jiva Pad calls the taste or ruchi that motivates the practice of Raganuga Bhakti. The terms raga, Ragatmika Bhakti, and Raganuga Bhakti, as well as intense desire for Ragatmika Bhakti or lobha, will all be defined and discussed in further detail in the section on Raganuga Bhakti later in this chapter, starting from verse 149. So that will come back to in much further discussion in detail later. So now that the distinction between Vaidhi-bhakti and Raganuga Bhakti has been made, we'll look more closely at Vaidhi-bhakti specifically. So from here, we'll look at how Jiva Gosvami elaborates on this subject in the Bhakti Sandarbha when he introduces Vaidhi-bhakti. So in Bhakti Sandarbha, Sri Jiva Pad elaborates further on the nature of the injunctions in the Shastra that are the fundamental motivation for the practice of Vaidhi-bhakti. So in other words, as a listener, you might say, okay, Vaidhi-bhakti means bhakti motivated by injunction, or it's injunction-based bhakti. So what kind of injunctions? All types, a particular type? What is really spoken about here by injunction, or vidhi? So that's what Jiva Gosvami elaborates on. This bhakti, known as unconditional, akinchana, absolute, atyantiki, and so on, meaning ahoituki, ahaitava, etc., meaning this bhakti that is propounded throughout Srimad Bhagavatam, is of two types, Vaidhi and Raganuga. In this regard, Vaidhi bhakti is bhakti that is impelled by injunctions stated in the Shastra. Okay? What kind of injunctions? Such injunctions, furthermore, are of two types. In that regard, the first type of injunction is that which is a cause of the inclination to enact bhakti. And the second type is that which is a cause of knowledge of what is to be done, what is not to be done, and the order in which things are meant to be done therein, that is, in such bhakti. So he's saying, there are some injunctions which simply tell you that you ought to do bhakti, and then there are some injunctions that tell you how to do bhakti. So when we say that bhakti is, quote, vaidhi, or injunction-based, then it means that it's based on both types of those injunctions. It's fundamentally motivated by bhakti that tells one that one ought to do bhakti, and it's guided by, or the way that it's practiced, or the way that it's expressed, is also governed by the injunctions that explain that it ought to be done in such way or not in such other way. So he gives examples. The first type of injunction is illustrated in the Bhagavad 1.12.14. Quote, therefore, Bhagavan, the protector of the Sattvas, that is, his bhaktas, is to be heard about, to be praised, to be meditated upon, and to be worshipped continuously with one mind. That is, with a one-pointed mind. So, here you have it early on in the Bhagavatam, second chapter, very early on. It's explaining what is bhakti, and then it's explaining who is Bhagavan, and then it's saying, Bhagavan is to be worshipped, to be meditated upon, etc. So you have it, an injunction, where it's just telling you, Bhagavan ought to be worshipped. So that is an example of the first type of injunction, where the Shastra directs people to perform bhakti. The second type of injunction, furthermore, is that which is related to ritual worship, rites, and so forth. In other words, it governs how the worship is meant to be done. Bhagavan Sri Krishna describes that in the Bhagavad 11.27.53. Quote, one attains me specifically through the practice of bhakti without motive, that is, through unconditional prema. And one who shall worship me in this way shall attain that practice or yoga of bhakti, that is, that unconditional prema. So he's talking about unconditional prema. That's obviously not Vaidhi-bhakti. In other words, that's what Vaidhi-bhakti can lead someone to. So you can attain me if you have prem. And if you, quote, worship me in this way, you can attain that prem. So where Vaidhi-bhakti is alluded to is in this statement, worship me in this way. So that's what Jiva Gosvami explains. Quote, without motive, nairapekshena, means without cause. That is, without desire for any object other than me and bhakti to me. Meaning, if one engages in a motiveless practice of bhakti, unconditional prema bhakti, wherein there is no other cause, that is no other object of pursuit than Bhagavan himself and bhakti to him, then as a result of that motiveless practice of bhakti, one will attain Bhagavan. In this regard, one may wonder, how can specifically a practice of bhakti without cause come about? That is, if one can attain Bhagavan Sri Krishna by way of a motiveless practice of bhakti, then how can one attain that motiveless practice of bhakti? To this he says, Bhakti Yogam. That is, Sri Krishna states the second half of the verse, wherein he says that one should perform ritual worship of himself in this way, evam. So, in this way, or evam, means in accord with stated injunctions that are mentioned earlier by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in verses 8 to 9. So earlier in the chapter, he'd already given some practical instructions about how worship is done, and then he's speaking of those and saying, worship me in this way, means in this way that I just explained, and you can get this state of being unmotivated in your practice of bhakti. In other words, you can reach the state of having prema bhakti, and when you have prema bhakti, then you will realize me. So then Jiva Gosvami quotes that those verses that are alluded to when he says, quote, in this way. And before I get to that, I'll just say, this is kind of a roundabout way of giving an example, isn't it? In other words, you might be saying, gosh, this is a little bit of a complicated example. So why is he quoting one thing to say that the example is just in this word evam, which actually refers to something else? So the reason he's going about it like this, you might say, why doesn't he just quote a verse directly where Krishna says, do puja like that? So the reason he's doing that is This is actually a brilliant move because he's actually citing a verse which shows that Vaidhi-bhakti leads to the attainment of prema-bhakti. And that's the whole that's the whole underlying unfolding of the stages of Uttama Bhakti that are going on here in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu. When we have Uttama Bhakti, and then that is of three types, it's sadhana, it's bhava, it's prema, then this citation from the Bhagavatam gives an example from Bhagavatam of the idea of Vaidhi-bhakti in a way that also shows that it leads specifically to prema bhakti. So he's actually being very precise, and he has a very practical purpose for this roundabout methodology. So just in case anyone was kind of like, why like this, then that's how I understand it. So anyway, getting to the point, he refers now to some of the injunctions that Bhagavan gives about how worship is to be performed. So there, in verses 8 and 9 in the 27th chapter, which is the whole chapter in the Uddhav Gita that deals with Archan, Krishna says, having attained the twice-bornness stated by the precept applicable to themselves. That is, the type of twice-bornness that is enjoined in the directives in the Veda for their personal eligibility, meaning their particular caste and so forth. When and how a person should worship me with bhakti and shraddha, hear that from me. One endowed with bhakti should unaffectedly worship me, I who am one's own guru, in a deity, or, if that is not possible, then in the first of whichever of the following is possible, on a piece of ground leveled for the performance of sacrifice, in a fire, in the sun, in water, in the heart, or in a twice-born. So that little parenthetical phrase I'm sticking in there from the Tika, because otherwise you would read it, and it would read that you should worship me, and you should worship me in the deity, or on the ground, or in the fire, or in the sun. And you might think, okay, then anywhere, doesn't matter, wherever. So the commentator comes along and says, actually, this is stated in a list of do it this way, but if you can't do that, then do this, and if you can't do that, then do this. So basically, he's enjoining deity worship of himself. So having become twice born, having gone through the necessary upbringing and so forth, we should perform worship of me in the deity, or if practically that's not possible, then in one of these other sites. Similarly, the second type of injunction is to be understood to also be related to Ekadashi, Janmashtami, and so forth. That is, the injunctions that cover when and how rites like those related to Ekadashi and Janmashtami are to be performed are also to be considered instances of the second types of injunctions that impel the practice of Vaidhi-bhakti. So the first type of injunction simply says, you should worship me. And the second type of injunction says, worship me in a deity, or in other words, worship me in this specific way. And then he doesn't bother giving an example, but he just says, or when these other injunctions pertain to Janmashtami. In other words, when the nakshatra is in this place, do the fast on this day, and then break the fast at this time, unless the nakshatra goes past sunrise, and in this case, break it at that time, and all those other rules that get into the technicalities or the specificities of when and where one is to fast, or when and where one is to perform archan. That is what's also alluded to here. Now, the divisions of Vaidhi, that is, the various forms of Vaidhi-bhakti, are Sharanapati, synonymous with Sharanagati, serving the Sat beginning with the Blessed Guru, hearing, praising, and so on. So in other words, Vaidhi-bhakti is of numerous types, and he gives examples. And as we mentioned this point earlier, and when we were discussing Sharanagati, he mentioned Sharanagati before everything else, even before serving the Guru. So that was something we discussed previously, that Sharanagati, tadiyatva siddhe, that without Sharanagati, there's no acceptance of one as his own, and it's only as a Sharanagata that one should venture to go to do any other practical type of sadhana, be it accepting a guru, serving a guru, performing worship, doing chanting, or what have you. The state of being a Sharanagata is the foundation of all of that. That's something we've already elaborated on, but this passage comes here also, so now we talked about it then, and now you can see it again as it flows in the unfolding of the discussion. So, these various forms of Vaidhi-bhakti, furthermore, both individually and in combinations of 2, 3, or more, become means by which bhava becomes manifest because of hearing and so on. Because of hearing so. That is, because examples of bhava becoming manifest through enactment of them are heard about in the Shastra. We'll give those examples later. Therein, that is, among the divisions of Vaidhi-bhakti, firstly, there is Sharanapati. So he puts it first in the list, and then he also says it on top of that Sharanapati is first. In summary, Vaidhi-bhakti is the form of sadhana-bhakti in which one's inclination to enact it arises not from loving attachment to bhakti's object, namely Bhagavan, or from intense desire for such loving attachment, but rather from the Shastra's injunctions that enjoin performing bhakti to Bhagavan and the manner in which such bhakti is to be performed. The numerous forms, that is, divisions or limbs of Vaidhi-bhakti, will be overviewed later in verses 113 to 142 of this chapter. So, I think we can conclude there for today. So from here on, having shown here from this excerpt of the Bhakti-sandarbha examples of injunctions, a similar set of examples are quoted here in the Caritamrta. So it was just said, one who without raga does bhajan on the basis of the Shastra's rule, that's called Vaidhi-bhakti. So then Kaviraja Goswami, or Mahaprabhu speaking to Sanatan, gives some examples of the Shastra giving that ruling or giving that direction to perform Vaidhi-bhakti. So we'll look at those examples. Some of them are also directly cited in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, so we'll look at the relevant commentaries on those from the Sindhu as well as the other Bhagavatam tikas in our next discussion. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has comments, questions, corrections, or any other feedback, please feel free to share. Yes, Vidyaji, is that your hand?
Jai Radha, Jai Radha.
Jai Shri Radha.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
So, yeah, okay. So I'm just listening to all these terms and try to summarize everything in context of Srimad Bhagavatam. So just like Mahaprabhu's line, Rupa Gosvami emphasizes this, the Raganuga Bhakti is the one that actually attracts Krishna, and is the main focus of Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. And then when you mentioned that Rupa Gosvami is creating this, kind of harmonizing both Raganuga and Vaidhi under one beautiful glorifying umbrella, but yes, stresses on Raganuga as the unique and the one that actually he wants to express and glorify, not demanding Vaidhi-bhakti. And I see the same thing in Bhagavatam, because Mahaprabhu came to augment the glories of Bhagavatam. And if you see through Bhagavatam, there are cases of both Vaidhi-bhaktas and Raganuga bhaktas being propelled and exemplified there. So as if the main character of Vaishnava school is simply bhakti, and how it develops is by the grace only. And I've heard this today that you mentioned that the Raganuga, the raga actually is the effect of grace. So I'm simply trying to put those thoughts into conclusive statement that actually what has to be glorified and focused on is simply bhakti as it is, and how it is developed. Of course, the process is there, but since it's an act of grace, one simply has to have that expectation in mind, in a heart, that actually, without the grace of Mahaprabhu, of Bhagavan, our efforts are has to be done. So we just simply have to strive to obtain bhakti, and how it develops and which direction it will go is just by the grace. So that's my outline of what I've heard today. But yet, I see that without acaryas, nothing can really move forward. So it's just where actually everything starts boiling down and developing. So I'm just wondering if this inspires you to say something more on that, or just yes, simply I just summarize what you just said.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. That's a nice summary. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I'll just say that that Raganuga Bhakti comes from grace alone is a point that's highlighted as the very last statement on the topic in this section in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu about Raganuga Bhakti. And as we know from hermeneutics, whatever you say at the very end is something that carries special weight. So there's definitely, and Jiva Goswami's, as we discussed earlier in the Sadhu Sangha Prakaran, the way that he speaks about Sadhu Sangha being the means by which bhakti comes to someone. So Bhagavan's grace coming through the sadhu to the fortunate person. This is, you could say, the overall framework of how this descends or how this unfolds. And we'll definitely hear more about that as we go on. So thanks for pointing that out.
Thank you. I'm just following thought. If bhakti comes by grace, is it possible that this bhakti may also be withdrawn temporarily by some actions of grace also even? Is it possible?
I mean, when in the case of what we call aparad, in other words, if we show ingratitude or we disrespect the source of the grace, if we bite the hand that's feeding us, so to speak, then we're told that can lead to a withering or a contrary trajectory. So there is some mention of something like this. And then in a more loose sense, we see that in the case of bhaktas, sometimes they may go through challenges or difficulties. They may feel as though they've lost something, but actually they're just going through a challenge which is enabling them to actually have more. So how and when Bhagavan brings his bhakta to him, he knows that very well. Like a doctor will, lead a patient through some stages of treatment, or a parent will take care of a child. It might not be fully understandable from a third-party perspective why something is being done just now. But the person, the expert who's overseeing the process will know fully well the benefit and the necessity of whatever treatment or process is unfolding at a given time. So perhaps something like that is also relevant to what you're pointing to.
Yes, I understand. Aparat is its main thing, but why would Bhakta, who is his heart is filled with strong affection, enthusiasm, utsaha is there, in the course of time lose its intensity, or his bhakti may lose intensity. It could be aparat, yes, of course, but why would that be happen? He's not wishing anything bad into his own Ishtadev. Is there any other reason that could happen? Like I've heard some Bhagavatam descriptions are saying, because of previous lifetime or few lifetimes back, this happened, that happened, and not necessarily aparat, but maybe even just the karmic evolution that will at one point curtail the progress or vision of bhakti even. This could also be the case, is it not?
Well, I mean, generally we don't see that karma has the power to interfere with bhakti. But, in the case of persons with, latent samskars for various non-bhakti activities, they may be practicing bhakti for a long time, but due to various latent non-devotional sanskars in their psyche, they may at times act contrary to that primary or that central focus that they have, and they will be held accountable for the consequences of those actions, just like they're given the result of all their other actions.
Right. So it seems like that bhakti is very active state. It's not a path that where you, I've attained that level of confidence, that level of achievement, that level of intensity. I'm okay now. And if this appears in the mind, I'm okay now, I'm fine, there's a lack of attention, and there's perhaps withdrawal of that intensity because of this lack of, I'll call it, lack of, the loose mentality. It's like, okay, I'm fine now, this confidence. And actually, I heard something long ago from some acharya from Madhva-sampradaya, from Udupi. He was saying that some may not disagree here in our school, but he said that the main problem for devotees is complacency. And it struck me at that time when I heard it. It's like, whoa, it sounds quite real to say that the main problem is the sense of feeling complacent in the path of sadhana. Will you comment on that?
I mean, sure. At this point, this is kind of a bit far off topic from what we've discussed today.
Yes.
Yes, in other words, there are many pitfalls and subtle challenges along the way, and that's something that we can get into further detail in when those topics come. But many things could be said on that topic, but I don't want to go on like a long analysis on this at this point in the class.
Okay, I'll hold you on that next time where we can.
Yeah, we can talk about it maybe outside the class or something like that.
Thank you. I'll keep this in mind. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No problem. All right, is this Brajananda?
Yes, Pranam Babaji.
Pranam.
So I feel very fortunate to receive so many Vidhi, but it seems difficult to digest each and every instructions received daily. Therefore, my question is it convenient to remain at least in an interrupted flow of kata, even if it's not fully absorbed in order to expect the slightest improvement in my bhajan?
Let me see if I understood what you're saying. You're saying an uninterrupted flow of kata, meaning some daily practice of engaging in hearing or discussion related to bhakti. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, and even if it's not fully absorbed and understood.
In other words, when you're talking about it, maybe you feel that you fully understand it, or maybe you feel that you don't. But in either case,
actually we can I can see that the science of bhakti is very intricate, and it's very difficult to absorb each point every day. But despite of that, if I cannot absorb all the instructions necessary to improve the Vaidhi-bhakti, at least if I am hearing, even if without completely understanding, is it beneficial in a way?
Definitely. I mean, in other words, to hear and understand is good, but we can't understand unless we keep on listening, keep on trying, you know. So, and in a broad sense, it's infinitely deep. So there isn't going to be some point where it's like, okay, pal, here's your PhD. Now you can walk around and everyone will think you're great and you know so much. You know, it's like, you know, Rupa Goswami at the end of the Ujjal Nilamani says, I just touched the tip of my finger on this ocean of Madhura Rasa and barely gave a subtle impression. So, you know, in something so vast, you know, we can't ever really claim to be experts or ever really claim to master it or whatever. So in that sense, we'll always feel a sense of that oceanic feeling, which is fine, you know, and mainly to, you know, keep going daily and feel the sense that we're, you know, getting something that's stimulating, that's challenging, that's enriching, that's leading to gradual absorption of some fresh and renewed and refined understanding, wherever we may be at that. It reminds me of there's a statement in the Stavamala where, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but where Rupa Goswami, he says that, when I think of all the great Mahajans that have worshipped you in such profound ways like Ambarish and Prahlad, I feel, who am I? I'm nobody. What can I ever offer you? But then when I think of how compassionate you are and how much you appreciate even what little your bhakti gives you, then I feel a drop of hope. So, you know, in other words, some of this stuff might seem very vast, and the standard of, you know, shuddhata that we aspire to is essentially superhuman. So, you know, we don't want to kind of stress the rigor of it to such an extent that we just feel like it's impossible and give up. But we want to stoke the process so that we're aspiring to something more. But, you know, like what our friend mentioned, like, we don't want to become complacent and be like, oh, it doesn't matter and blah, blah, blah. But we don't want to, you know, become depressed that we're so far behind or that there are so many people so much better. We want to find this middle zone where we're, you know, able to enthusiastically continue and at the same time have realistic expectations.
Yes, actually, this is the hope I maintain day after day, even if I'm not fully aware of what it is the thought about, but still, I have some hope. Thank you.
Sure. And having something new to learn is actually something that will make you happy all the time. In other words, you know, the famous saying, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? But the opposite. In other words, when you can have something, but feel like there's something that you're going to get again more that's soon and going to be good, that's actually a very wonderful place to be. That I've got something good and I've got something more just on the cusp. And that's what a bhakta's life can always be. So.
Jayarade, I have a question.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. So, okay, you mentioned three things, or three different qualifications for Raganuga bhajan. And the words used was like, first of all, raga. So I understand raga means like some attachment, some passion, some love, which is very high. That's a very high level. And then there were other two, and I think another one was intense desire. And it seems to me like the lowest threshold is to have ruchi, to have a taste, to have like a liking. So do I have that? Do I have it correct? Like it appears to me that there are, you know, I wouldn't say maybe 3 levels, but at least the lowest threshold to cross in qualification for the practice of, or what defines like qualification for Raganuga Bhakti is to have this ruchi, this taste, and then even better, this intense desire for raga, or to have raga already, to have this passion, this love. So do I have that understood correctly?
Well, in this, I mean, this is a topic that we'll definitely get into full detail on a little bit later, but at this stage, we'll say that here raga, bhakti, when someone is doing bhakti and has raga, they would be called a ragatmika. So raganuga is the bhakti that is performed with the aim of becoming ragatmika. So a raganuga won't have raga because they're trying to get raga. Once they go from wanting raga to having raga, they transition from raganuga to ragatmika. So in the case of the raganugas, they don't have raga, they have what Rupa Gosvami calls lobha and what Jiva Gosvami called ruchi for that raga. They want the raga, or they have taste for this raga. So what exactly means that, quote, lobha or ruchi? What does that exactly mean? How intense of a desire is that? We'll see, we'll look at the exact way that that is elucidated a little later on in the other comments that the acaryas make on that. But, simply put, that there's a gradation in the intensity that can exist. And Jiva Gosvami also makes one statement in the Bhakti-sandarbha where he even speaks of an ajata ruchi sadhaka, or a sadhaka who even lacks that ruchi. And in this context, ruchi and lobha have been used as synonyms. And he speaks of sadmatra adar, or that they're adrita. In other words, even someone who lacks that ruchi, or lacks that lobha, but has what is called adar, some adoration, or some high regard for those parikaras, he says that is, you could say, the most basic point of departure on this path. That the adhikar, or the thing that will progressively make you more and more eligible, is the level of intense desire you have for that raga. But he's recognizing that not everyone is going to immediately have all that much of that. So he says that in the most, preliminary stage, there can just be a sense of deep regard, some type of sense that this is really great, or this is really worthy of adoration, even if I may at this stage not feel that intense of a desire for it. And so that passage, I think it's in Anucheda 312. But anyway, we'll definitely get to that and other related topics when we come to the Raganuga section. So in short, to answer your question, the follower of the Raganuga path will have some degree of desire for the raga of the ragatmika parikaras. The more the better. And may initially have very little or very weak, but have at least a sense of profound regard that this is really the most worthy object, an object most worthy of aspiration. And then as their sadhana matures, then you could say the maturation of their sadhana is the maturation of that desire, or of that longing. And that's a point that we'll get to again later, which Radhakrishna Das Goswami makes in his Dashloki Bhashya in a very vivid way, where he explains that the various sadhanas that the Raganuga sadhaka does are functionally have the purpose of simply nourishing the lobha for the raga. In other words, it's not that these sadhanas are creating bhakti, but that they're functioning so as to deepen the sanskar for bhakti, so as to more deeply desire that raga or that raga bhakti of the ragatmika parikaras. And that they have an effect, or they're a process in that sense, that they're nourishing or fortifying that desire. And it's that desire which will induce Bhagavan to bless one with this type of bhakti. So that verse that was in the Ramananda Sangvad, Tatra lolyam api mulyam akalam, that the only price is lolya. The only thing you need, or the only thing you must provide in order to get this, is the desire. But you don't just get the desire like magic. You get the desire from doing all of these processes that lead to the fortification of the desire. Hence, chanting, meditation, study, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And that point is also made by Kaviraja Goswami in the opening verse of the Dashloki when he says, Gada lolyaika labdhya, that this is attainable only by gada lolya, or intense longing. So if someone is aspiring on this path and can understand that their longing is not all that intense, then they can, understand. They can humbly understand that I'm following this process and I know that the intensity of my desire is not that great, so I can't style myself to be more than I am, but I can just accept where I'm at and I can continue to practice, continue to engage in these processes which both purge the psyche or purify the psyche of other desires, in other words, do what's called chitta shuddhi, and nourish and deepen the desire for this bhav of Bhagavan's parikaras, which is the object of my sadhana. And so they can try to their ability. It's not magic. No one, there's no super secret esoteric tricks to doing that. It's, a gradual transformation of the psyche, and nobody can do it for you, and just being part of a group doesn't mean that it's done for you. It's something that's deeply personal, and something that, requires a very deep commitment and practice of an individual. And it all has value, right? The change that we put, the samskars that we create, those things travel with us, embedded in the psyche, embedded in the subtle body, life after life. So we can have this much confidence that how we attune the psyche, how we deepen these samskaras is like, investing or, putting, building this thing, which can bring us to that point of having that type of purity and one-pointedness and intensity of desire. And as the Dambandhan Leela and so many other things in the Bhagavatam demonstrate, where there is that hunger, where there is that desire, then proportionately, Bhagavan will be there to reciprocate. So those are all topics we'll get into in more detail later on, but I hope does that get to what you wanted to talk?
Thank you. Perfecto.
Okay. Vidyaji, did you have something else to say?
Yes, just a quick refresh here. You just mentioned, if I heard correctly, Gada Lolya, which is referring to intense longing. Is the word Tivra, that Bhakti Tivra Yogana, like in the verse, in Bhagavatam verse, Akama Sarva Kambhava, Moksha Kama Utarati, Tivra Bhakti Yogana. So Tivra, would it mean like intense, like really strong or committed? Would that have the same meaning like Gadalolium?
Parallel. It would refer to Tibra means powerful or intense, so it would mean Tibrena Bhakti Yogena would be intense practice of bhakti. Tibra Yoga. So if I recall, I believe I've read in one of the commentaries, an instance of this was used to refer to Dhruva Maharaj, because Dhruva Maharaj didn't have a guru, Dhruva Maharaj was not a Raganuga Bhakta, Dhruva Maharaj didn't have, all of these things, but he had really intense sadhana. And as a result of that, he got darshan of Bhagavan and all these things. So that Tibrata can refer to the intensity with which one practices, but that intensity of practice may be of multiple types. So it could refer to, or it could cover, the intensity of desire of a Raganuga sadhaka, but it wouldn't only refer to that, it would also refer to, someone like Dhruva Maharaj, who was a Vaidhi-bhakta. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, I understand. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, I think we've gone plenty long, so I'll sign off here for today. And if we're so blessed, then next week we'll resume our discussion of the Sanatan Shiksha. We'll look further at some of the details of Vaidhi-bhakti. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Jai Shri Radhe.
Jai Shri Gaur.